both technology and social impact are such a strong focus here in the Bay Area, which is why it's not surprising that the technology firms are taking such a strong role in promoting social impact in their businesses. Our third panel of the day, Technology in the Service of Social Impact, will cover some of these particular aspects. And I'll invite the technology panel to come out here, and the panel moderator, Mr. Paul Arnpriester, will talk more about it. Everybody please welcome the technology panel.
All right. So I have the pleasure to help direct the efforts of our nonprofit team at CDW. We have about 70 folks that work just with nonprofit organizations throughout North America, as well as we have a number of our customers that also have a global footprint, whether it's in the faith-based space, the social service space, the foundation space, associations, museums, culture, the list goes on and on. We have about 10,000 base customers, and then we have other customers we do business with as well. Technology innovation in the social sector is always something that I find both in real life as well as in planning and strategy around how can we help using technology make a significant impact, and really where does innovation come into play in that? If we was to ask for a hand showing of what technology innovation or even what innovation means to you, we'd probably get a large number of diverse answers. You know, Steve Jobs in his famous commencement speech stated that for innovation, especially technology innovation, you can only look backwards, you can't look forward, because if you look backwards, you can connect those dots. And by connecting those dots, then you're able to associate, whether it be with common life practices that are ongoing, whether it be with education, whether it be with your karma. He's always relied on connecting the dots to be able to help him push forward. Richard Branson said, there's only one mantra in my company, and it's ABCD. ABCD, what is that? Again, always be connecting dots. And then Seth Godin, in his famous manifesto, talked again about connecting the dots and how it applied to students, especially graduate students and senior level students. And his comment was, we're good at, as educators, as teaching that there are dots, but the students themselves have to be able to find out where the dots are. And are the dots even there yet? And to the extent that they are, how do we connect them? And so before we get to our panel, I thought it might be interesting to just look at this brief 1-minute video, if you'll play that, please.
Life is made of dots. Many, in fact most people, believe that the dots they see every day are all the dots there are. So life goes along according to these known dots. Decisions and solutions are based on these commonly known dots, as well as many conclusions too. Some companies build their entire businesses on these known dots. This we know as the status quo, business as usual. Then one day, someone comes along and sees one or more dots beyond the commonly agreed upon dots. Dots that others missed, dots that are ignored, dots that others have long since forgotten about. Some like these new dots and celebrate this new discovery, liking how things currently are, comfortable with everyday dots. Some protest these new dots. Some even claim they aren't valid, or worse, are imaginary dots that don't even exist. Yet, it's these new dots that potentially change everything. What is the source of these new dots? Notions. Unexpected connections. Ideas. Possibilities. So what is innovation? Those other dots, the ones others miss. And having the certainty to know that the dots you see are not only valid, but necessary if the world is to move forward.
Thank you. So with that background, let's move to our panel. We have a great group of panelists here. I am excited to be with you and to be with the panelists today. Before we begin, if I may, let's introduce the panel. Ask each one of you to introduce yourself, if you would, please.
Starting with me? Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for having me this afternoon. My name is Scott Coleman, and I lead the partnerships team for two groups within Google called Social Impact and Google Ideas. And essentially what we do is we build and deploy technology for good. In practice, that means that I support roughly 5 different product focus areas, and we focus on consumer applications as well as B2B. Some examples of this would be things like crisis response. So we provide public alerting information in 9 countries, so we can tell you that a tornado is coming your way and tell you what to do about it. We've also deployed elections and politics programs in over 40 countries. Prior to that, I spent about 3 years working on our access initiatives, and so spent a lot of time in Africa setting up a fiber network in Kampala, Uganda. And before that, I helped to set up our offices in Latin America and India. So thank you.
Nice. Thank you, Scott. Brandon?
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brandon Middaugh. I'm the Chief of Staff at SunEdison, which is a global renewable energy developer. In my role there, I'm responsible for our social innovations program. So for us, technology innovation for social impact has a lot to do with deploying products and solutions to provide clean, reliable power to the 1.3 billion people who lack electricity completely, and the additional billion people who are underserved or lack reliable electricity.
And my name is Corey Marshall. Can you hear me okay? My name is Corey Marshall. I'm the director of Splunk for Good, which is the social impact program for Splunk, which is a big data company. So we have a really powerful product in Splunk, and so my job is essentially to leverage that product and our amazing people out in the community to do public proofs of concept and things around areas like disaster response, transparency, and open data. And to build those public proofs of concept in ways that are accessible by the public and always live. We have a product that has not actually been found to find the processing ceiling of it yet, so I guess I view my job as to try and break it, and I haven't been able to do it yet.
That's a great way to segue into our next question. What do you see as as kind of the next big thing, if you will, with respect to technology innovation between the philanthropic sector, okay, on the one hand, that will contribute to social change?
I mean, I think from my perspective, I mean, this is a very apt example with the connecting of the dots. I think what we've been seeing is a lot of companies and different organizations engaging in silos and engaging in isolation of one another. And where we're going to need to see more advancement is going to be in coordinated efforts to build infrastructure to support whatever this next generation of philanthropy and giving and social engagement is going to be. Because without that level of coordination and without the investment in the infrastructure, you're really just putting Band-Aids all over the place. And there's a need to really shake things up, and there are finally technologies available that are sufficiently scalable and sufficiently applicable to a lot of these organizations and accessible from a cost perspective to be able to really make a dent. And I've had conversations as recently as yesterday about folks that are willing to help make an investment in a coordinated strategy and willing to put the time and the effort in to bringing all the necessary funders and players to the table to make that happen. And that doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? So you need to bring the appropriate public and private funders to the table. Government plays a huge role in this type of conversation because they are one of the primary funders for a lot of these different types of efforts. And the challenge here is that they have actually had the lowest expectations in many regards. And so it's really a game of trying to raise the bar in terms of what we expect from a lot of the nonprofits that are out there and try to figure out a way to help support them in a way that is sustainable.
So in the spirit of connecting the dots, one of the things that we see in our work is a recognition that as we're deploying infrastructure and distributed power globally, we are often doing so in service of healthcare clinics, schools, large hospitals, community centers where people are going to access the internet or to charge their mobile devices. And so we really see opportunities for collaboration, both on the technological innovation side, deploying batteries, testing out new products that aren't ready yet for our core business, but which we hope to one day graduate into that core business, and also testing out business models. So the connecting the dots motif is very apt for us as well. And I think we're expecting to see an enormous opportunity in matching the demand patterns when people are using power and for what purpose with the production of clean power, which follows wind production often at night and solar production often during the day.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective in the world that I live in, the technology advance is pretty simple. It's your mobile phone. I think that's going to change the way that people access all kinds of products and services. It already is changing that. So I think anything that gets developed needs to have a mobile-first orientation. So I think that's probably the first thing that I would highlight. I also think, building on your point, the business models matter. And I think if we look back to the last presentation, what you're seeing is a lot more types of organizations, whether that's a B Corp or mission-oriented company or whatever it might be, where having a social impact is a priority. And so I think there's a willingness to actually raise the profile of those types of efforts within a traditional corporate environment, and I think that's going to have a transformative effect.
We're seeing that from our perspective in the technology space at CDW, where we try to do business with companies. Many times, and especially of late, they're asking, what is your shared value message? What message do you have that shows a shared value, not only on the for-profit side, but also on the nonprofit side? So internally, we have to do some thinking and some reviewing and actually making a way for us to share our messaging around how we help, within the community on the nonprofit side, and give this shared value message. I think that's a great point. What, taking that a step further, you had mentioned about governments and kind of a role that they play in technology innovation. What do you see as an opportunity and responsibility for the various stakeholders in kind of this ecosystem, if you will?
I mean, I believe that government doesn't fully utilize its power as a convener. And so this is one of their opportunities where they not only have this amazing convening power because of their position as a primary service provider, but also as a primary funder, like I was mentioning before, for a lot of the programs and services that you actually experience on the ground. And for them to be able to pull together a range of stakeholders from the public, private, nonprofit, and funding sectors, I think that that's an extremely powerful proposition, because then you can start to discuss the needs that you have with, in regards to energy generation, in regards to service discovery, how you design the service provision, how you're prioritizing those types of services, and have open and honest dialogue about that, and really expect people to start to step up to the plate with some of those things. Because I've worked with a number of nonprofits across the years, many of whom had difficulty bridging the gap between different types of technologies and providing their services, and some that just completely avoided the issue altogether and at their own peril, frankly. And that, those aren't just the old line ones as well. I mean, Scott mentioned that there are a lot that have to start to investigate new business models, right? That's actually a really important point, because some of the most, quote, successful new service providers that are out there in the nonprofit space still haven't figured it out, because they're relying on a lot of the same old models to survive as some of the older line nonprofits are, but they don't yet have the capacity to do it, so they may never get there.
And to carry that a step further, I see a lot of analogies between the democratization of information, the rise of mobile technologies, and we're seeing analogous trends in the energy space as well. moving towards distributed generation, storage on site, microgrids, micro stations to produce power for local communities that can be proactive consumers, not just taking power off the grid. And the logical next step is that you have a host of additional stakeholders that maybe you've never had before in a world when the only counterparty to a decision was local or national government. And so I think that it's an exciting moment to be in the technology space, in the energy space, working with communities to make those decisions and bringing all the stakeholders to the table for civil society progress, not just business as usual.
Yeah, Scott, just taking that a step further from a partnership perspective, Google partnerships, building a consortium is hard. What are some of the most important aspects, if you would share, about what makes a partnership work, what makes it successful?
Sure. So in our work, we do a lot of what I call B2B2C type products. And so we'll work with the government, for example. Just to pick a country, we worked with the Mexican government, and we work with their weather agency. We hook into their data, and we're able to provide a consumer-facing service. And so essentially, that's how we issue a public alert to say, an earthquake just happened, and here's the different types of things you can do about it. And I think in that model, the reason why that works is because we're each focused on our core competencies, right? So the government is good at collecting that data, at validating it, at providing the recommended actions. What Google is good at is actually doing something with that data, turning it into a service or a product or an application that you can actually use and is useful to an end consumer. So I think in those cases, it's just figuring out where the core competencies are and how you structure a win-win relationship.
Okay. Do you feel that the measurements that Google uses, on the one hand, are the same, if you will? I mean, you touched on it a bit, but are they the same as what is used in the government space or the nonprofit sector? They're probably not, right? Or do you feel they
The measurement question.
Yeah.
So measurement's a tricky issue, obviously, in this world. I mean, I think, so I don't know the quick answer if we measure things in the same way, but I do know from the products that I support, the types of things that we think about is what is the end impact? So knowing that we have a lot of users, that's a good indicator. Knowing that people like certain things, that's another good indicator. Knowing things like the click-through rate, that can tell you essentially user engagement and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, what we really care about in an area like crisis response is, are we actually helping people in need? So are we accessing people in an affected area? So if a typhoon comes, are we getting information to people early enough? Are they able to do something with it? Are they able to react to it? Is it actually helping to save someone's lives in the extreme case? So I think what that gets to is we can measure a lot of really normal things that are in software products, and then we push ourselves to go a little bit further than that and think about what's the real world impact we want to have.
Right. Corey, your thoughts? Government, nonprofit versus...
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with this question because I come from, I've spent a long time in and around government in a variety of different capacities, right? So both on the nonprofit and the for-profit side, working with and for government. And my challenge is always one of expectations. And it really comes down to whether we're measuring the right things, right? So you're talking about whether or not you're having an impact. And unfortunately, what I've found many, many times is that when you're talking about your public sector cohorts or colleagues, they're worried more about the process than they are what it's in service to. And so what you're seeing in recent years is actually a shift away from that. And you're starting to see them acknowledge that they need to deal more with the end user, and they need to really think about what the impact on the ground is going to be. There's a long way to go, though, because as you said, it's very, very difficult, right? But this goes back to the point that I made earlier, just about needing to build the infrastructure there. And that's not just systems-based infrastructure and the technology that's necessary, but it's also about coming up with ways to measure those things that are meaningful, not only to us as organizations or as private sector stakeholders, but also to the public, right? Because ultimately, if somebody's riding transit, do they really care who's providing the service? They care about whether or not they're able to get there on time. If there's something blocking the road, do they care why? They don't care why. They care whether or not they're going to be able to get where they're going. So we need to really think about how we're oriented in these conversations and try to get the focus to be shifted more towards the individual and that experience rather than what the process is, who owns it, and why things aren't happening.
In the energy industry, we have a phrase for that phenomenon. We call it the cold beer, hot showers phenomenon, in which the consumer wants the cold beer and the hot showers. They want the light switch to go on when they enter the room. And we, in the energy industry, in the clean energy industry specifically, need to provide the same reliability, the same quality, and above and beyond all of that, the best price and the cleanest and most reliable product. So I think that to your point, especially when we're talking about social impact through public goods, like internet access, like lighting, like public transit, it's important to measure the right things and keep in mind that the end user is the ultimate arbiter of whether you've satisfied the ultimate need, which is theirs.
Better than a hot beer and a cold shower.
So Brandon, the nonprofit area, and I think our audience will agree with me, is sometimes assumed to be underdeveloped when it comes to technology, when it comes to innovating, using technology in the nonprofit space. Do you feel that's the case based on your exposure? Is that what you're seeing, or do you think nonprofit is slowly but surely catching up, or have they evened out? What's your thoughts?
I would frame it this way. We see an important role for what we consider strategic charity, working with partners to reach communities we cannot reach through an alternate business model. Recently, we partnered with Grid Alternatives to do a solar jobs training program and to deploy solar panels on low-income housing throughout the United States. But ultimately, we think that for a lot of these models to reach scale and to be sustainable in the economic sense, they need to stand on their own 2 feet. And so we have a program by which we have technologies that are incubated through break-even or revolving loan funds, and then are able to graduate into a core business, with the ultimate goal for these to be fully profitable technologies that can be deployed globally, because we really believe that's where the momentum will be.
From your vantage point, Scott?
I would say the nonprofit sector in general mirrors other sectors. So I do think there's a wide range of technology-forward organizations and those that aren't technology-forward. I'd say that the nonprofit sector is probably a little bit further behind, and I would say that's because you don't have the R&D expenditure, right? If you think about the core of the business, people don't have the luxury, to drop $50 million on a large R&D project, right? When you're busy fundraising. That said, I do think there's some nonprofits that are doing some incredibly innovative stuff with technology, and I think, if I look at something like Khan Academy, right? What's interesting there is not necessarily just the videos. It's that there's machine learning behind it, and it's adaptive learning for the kids. So that's an interesting space where someone decided to use a nonprofit model, but has a really technology center in that business.
From your vantage point, Corey, what do you see? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I would echo the point that the nonprofit community is not a monolith, right? So you're going to have varies of gradation throughout. But what I have seen is there's a stark difference between the new generation of nonprofits that are spinning up and some of the older line ones, where you have a lot of history, and I hesitate to say baggage, that comes along with that from a cultural perspective, and some hesitation to adopt new technologies because they are large organizations that for whatever service they're providing or group of services they're providing, they're sustaining, right? So they have a funding model that tends to work for them and generally supports those things. But they do have a shortage of the R&D dollars to be able to experiment with those things to make the necessary transitions that you might need. Some of the newer ones, though, are definitely adopting and putting to use some of those technologies. You have folks that are using a lot of machine learning, not of the scale of Khan Academy for sure, but smaller ones that are using machine learning on the back end and relying very heavily on data science around this whole question of how you dispatch, whether it's vehicles or services or whatever, right? And so there's a whole universe of possibilities there, but they don't have the new ones don't have the funding to get there. The old ones have the funding, but not necessarily the will to get there. So there's something that needs to happen in between that catalyzes them to action on both sides of that, both from a funding perspective and an organizational perspective.
Would you see the role of corporations or government involved in that process, helping to bridge that gap, if you will? What do you see as the role of government or corporations? I would ask this to all three of you, please.
I mean, if I'm going to start. So as facilitator and convener. So I think, and again, you have very diverse perspectives amongst the corporate and the government sectors. And, you know, we're describing those very generally, right? But they have all kinds of issues at all different levels and sometimes are at odds with themselves even. But when it really comes down to it, those can both be facilitators and enablers, right? So from the technology community perspective, dare I speak on their behalf or our behalf, I mean, there are technologies that can be deployed. There are people that can be brought to bear. There's not only the people that are engineers, there's also people that have fantastic business minds about new sustainable, in the economic sense, business models, right? And that actually has to be something that is put at the forefront of the conversation, is this idea of financial sustainability, because there are lots of organizations out there that are operating all kinds of services at a loss that maybe shouldn't be. And we need to have hard conversations about where we're allocating funds, what types of services we're providing, and it's not to say that those need to be entirely financially driven, but there needs to be a model and an approach that's sound to be able to support them. Because if over time you're operating at a deficit and you don't have a plan to fill that gap, that's something that's never going to be fully sustainable on its own.
Go for it. No, please.
I would just add that to the point about R&D as well, there's an important role for the private sector to play in providing the lessons learned from the guest test and revise method that is carried out in new markets with new products. And I think that some of that lessons learned can result in institutional learning, not only for one organization, but for an entire community trying to tackle a given objective.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, what the private sector is doing naturally is actually very helpful, just driving the cost of a lot of these things down. If you think about things like storage or you think about big data, it's becoming accessible to a lot more organizations than it ever has been in the past. And I think that's actually a really powerful thing that the private sector is doing. Beyond that, on the flip side of it, I think they're also increasing the ease of use, right? And so, you know, building better services and tools that actually could allow nonprofits to deploy, you know, this type of technology into their model. And I think those are some of the elements that the private sector is helping out the nonprofits.
But one final point on this. I mean,
Yep.
I think it's really important for us to note that technology in and of itself is not the solution, right? It's an
Exactly.
enabler.
Yep.
It increases the accessibility to information. It increases the ease of use and access to programs. It is not in and of itself the end, right? This is a means to the end.
Yep.
Good point. Good point. Let's stop for a minute and see if anyone in the audience would have a question for our panelists around that topic. Yes.
I just wanted to immediately follow up on the question that you were just saying, and how technology in and of itself isn't the solution. So I'm curious, what do you think is the role of the tech companies in helping people use those services and training the nonprofits and how to use the connectivity and the access resources that they have? I come from education, so you constantly hear of, you know, the new computers sitting in a box in the closet because nobody knows how to use them. And so I'm curious, you know, what role do you think the technology industry can play in helping some of the lower income groups utilize those services?
You care to take that?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I focus on with Splunk, I mean, we have very limited resources, at least for our program on our side as well, and I try to be strategic in how we deploy those things, right? So one of the things that we do have available is a nonprofit licensing program. You know, Splunk is not necessarily the type of technology like a CDW would have that's Microsoft-based or something that's easily rolled out. So exactly to your point, right? We don't necessarily go after organizations that don't have the ability to take it up. But we don't hesitate when they ask for assistance, right? So as long as they have the awareness that they have that shortfall, we have the ability to help them. And so the responsibility is there. It can't just be dropping the boxes off on the corner and driving away. It really does have to be a more meaningful and not necessarily sustained engagement, but at least sustained for long enough to allow for the adoption phase of that equation to take place.
Additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I have kind of two thoughts. One is a bit of a non sequitur, but when I think about that, that to me feels like a user experience problem, right? I mean, it feels like you're not understanding who your end client is, you don't understand your user, you haven't done the needs assessment, you really don't understand how what you're deploying would fit in the daily life or the workflow of that person or that organization. So I think something that technology companies can do is actually be very smart about how they do design. So that'd be the first starting point. I think the second piece would be, once you do have that product and service, is to have programmatic education, right? I think of one of the programs that we have at Google, which is called Google Earth Outreach. And the idea there is Google Earth is this amazing visualization tool to see the world. Can you add in information on that could help a nonprofit to tell their story? So you can see things like the effect of logging, or you can see like a urbanization or sprawl happening on the globe. And so the way we do that is actually partner really closely with a nonprofit and teach them what are the best uses for this type of tool. And you can do that with people, or you can do that online, or through more scalable solutions.
One other question. Anyone? Yes, in the back at the left, please.
Thanks so much. Obviously, technology can be used for good in many capacities, but I'm wondering if you can comment on anything we should watch for as we get more into the age of information, and is there such thing as too much technology?
I guess I can start. So that's an interesting question. Yeah, I think Corey's point was really good. I think not seeing technology as the end solution in and of itself, right? Thinking of it as an enabler to help people ultimately do something. I think that's pretty important. Beyond that, I think privacy is extremely important, right? So being very thoughtful about the type of information you collect, what you do with it, how are you using that to, if you're improving your products and services, what's your strategy for doing that? And the more mundane things, like what are your access levels, like who's able to see all these different types of things. I think that's super important. And I think as we get into a more technologically forward world, those become bigger and bigger things to keep at the forefront.
Further thoughts? You good?
I think you got that one down.
I would love to add to something, especially on the privacy point. It really is important for everybody to understand the magnitude of information that you're putting out into the world, right? One of the things that we do, we host a lot of community groups, as I'm sure both of you do as well, of children, anywhere in ages from like 8 to 16, right? And the first thing that we show them is an analysis of their social media. And their minds are blown instantly, right? You mean you can see that? It's like, yeah, I can see that. In fact, I can tell you exactly who you're sending text messages to. I can tell you when you're doing it, under what circumstances, and I don't even have to have access directly to their information. But the most important piece of this, especially as it pertains to privacy, as more and more information is being generated, is be very cognizant of the data that you're putting into the world and how you lock it down, how you have the ability to control it, how you have the ability to not control it and share it. There's value on both sides of that, right? But just be aware, be digitally literate about how you interact with the world.
And that gets to an entire category of educational, the contribution, another contribution that the private sector can have is education around how that works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also think in the sustainability is a pretty important component of it. If you think about just building stuff and hardware, and being pretty thoughtful about what does the supply chain look like. What types of hard metals are going into all kinds of different products. So I think that becomes an increasingly important piece as well. And I mentioned that mobile phone, I think, is probably the most important technology that's happening right now, and there's that has a very important supply chain to pay attention to.
Good point. good point. You know, I had the question, what advice would you offer to anyone who was looking to spearhead a technology initiative or take their core competency and further that? You've answered that question already. Thank you very much. So last question, okay, and then we'll cut. And I would ask this to each of you again, just share with the audience, if you could sit down with one person, historical, fictional, current individual, and ask them how they would move that needle, applying technology innovation or connecting the dots, share with us, who would that be? Brandon, why don't you start?
So the person who comes to mind for me is Muhammad Yunus, whose innovation is not straight down the fairway in the technology category, but as I am dedicating my career to deploying clean energy, so much of the answer is financial solutions and the financing structures that are required to make deployment of these technologies feasible on a global scale. And so while he doesn't quite fall into your into the framework of a technological pioneer, he's very much a business model pioneer. And I would really posit, as we look at storage, data storage, energy storage, and some of the other triple bottom line technologies that we're working on deploying, I would really encourage us to be thinking about how you reach the end user and what the structure is that's most effective to reach the most people.
Yeah, Mohammed, a Nobel Peace Prize winner,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Started
For
the Grammy
microfinance.
Yeah,
Grammy.
Grammy Foundation.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
He's mobile to another level.
That's true, actually. Then I'm glad you've tied that back in. Yes, his history was in mobile banking and bringing loans to the unbanked portion of the South Asian population.
To me, so I think Bill Gates. I think, and maybe not necessarily on again the pure technology piece, but I do think that the way the Gates Foundation is trying to solve some of these problems is really important. So looking at the overall, what's the large market failure, and how do you plug that in a really big way? So that'd be nice.
Great. Corey, take us home.
I think I'd like to have a combination of two deceased luminaries. I'm gonna
Anything
combine,
is possible. Anything is possible.
I'm gonna combine John F. Kennedy and Steve Jobs.
Wow.
So that you can combine both the technological vision that's necessary and how you create the political will to make it happen.
That's great.
What's our next generation's moonshot?
Yeah. Thank you very much, panelists, for your time.
Thank you, Paul.
For your answers, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with the audience and myself today. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.